would sit down and they would go in a room and they would go over the mission and they would figure out what they did right, what they did wrong, what they could do better, and all that. And to me, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. And I think I told y'all before that we have two reviews a year, and they used to give us a paper that we had to fill out. Brother Wayne was talking about 1999 and the year 2000, Y2K. They used to give us a paper. Now we do it online, Brother Wayne. We do it on the computer. But we used to do it on the paper. And we used to have to write it down and, what went well this year. Give me some examples. What didn't go well. And give us some examples. And what could you have done differently? And people, I think, are scared to just admit, hey, this didn't go so well. They're just scared to admit, I really messed up right there. I really messed up right there. I had good intentions and I just didn't do what I was supposed to do. And you can take it in your Christian life. You can take it to something as simple as just reading your Bible this week. Some people have a goal they're just going to read their Bible. Some people have a goal they're going to read 5 chapters a day. Some people have a goal they're going to read 10 chapters a day. Some people, whatever your goal is, you have a goal. And I'd be curious if your goal, if your goal was whatever, 1 chapter a day, 5 chapters a day, 10 chapters a day, whatever your goal was, if I asked for a show of hands, how many people would have to raise their hand and say, yeah, I didn't hit my goal this week? If your goal is, hey, I'm going to get up an hour early every morning. I got to leave for work at 7 o'clock in the morning or whatever time you leave for work. I'm going to get up an hour early every morning, and I'm going to dedicate myself to reading my Bible and praying, whatever your goal is. And then your alarm goes off, and instead of getting up with the alarm, you smack it. You snooze. And then it goes off again 8, 9, 10 minutes later, and you smack it and hit snooze. And you're like, just not today, Lord. Not today. And so you'll go throughout the day, and you're like, man, I was going to do that. And so, or maybe it's praying. Maybe it's praying. You're like, I am going to pray for every person in the Concord Baptist Church. I'm going to pray for every person who is in Concord Baptist Church. And then it's funny because I try to pray for everyone in Concord Baptist Church. And I'll forget someone. Inevitably, I'm going to forget someone. And so a lot of times I'll stand up there when I'm doing the sound stuff, and I'll stand and I'll look over and I just go through the crowd. And when I pray, I start up here with Brother Andy and his family, and then I work over to Miss Jimmy, and then I just start down this aisle, and then I go down this aisle, and then I come down this aisle. And you're pretty close to last, Brother Wayne. Yes, sir, you are. I'm sorry. But anyway, but I do remember you, Brother Wayne. I do remember you. But anyway, so, and sometimes I'll stand up there and I'll look, I'm like, man, I can't believe I forgot so-and-so. I cannot believe that I forgot. Sometimes, and Brother Donnie called me this morning, and Brother Donnie gets me because they don't sit in the same spot. Just about everyone sits in the same spot, which I know Brother Parks is not in his normal spot right here. But, everyone kind of sits in their same spot. But Brother Donnie, because they sit, they're in Sunday school, sometimes they're over here, and sometimes they're over here, sometimes they're over here. So they're just all over the place. And sometimes Brother Donnie will get me. And later in the day, I'll remember, I'm like, oh, I didn't pray for Brother Donnie, Miss Marilyn. And so there are, that's just something, it's not a small thing, because I think you should read your Bible. I think you should pray. But how many times do we get up and we just take off in our day and realize, man, I didn't really take the time to pray this morning. I didn't take the time. And I like to pray in my van. I'm in my van, and I can kind of lock everything out, and I'm driving for hours and hours sometimes, and I can pray in my van. But sometimes I get in my van, and it's the moment I get in my van, my phone rings. And then it rings again, and then it rings again, and then it rings again. And before long, I'm already in Marietta, and I've had 3-4 conversations, and I didn't have the conversation I meant to have. And so it's a failure that happens. And we can do better, but we have to determine in our hearts to do better. And somewhere Demas had failure that came up in his life. And we know it says that he loved this present world. But there was somewhere in his life where he looked and he said, oh, that looks fun. And in his heart he was convicted, or he should have been convicted if he was a Christian. The Bible never tells us whether or not he was a Christian or not. You know, we would have all said there was no way Lot was saved, or Lot was, obviously it sounds different back then, but there was no way Lot, but the Bible in the New Testament says that he was a just man. And so the Bible never tells us whether or not Demas was saved or not. But if you're saved, God, the Holy Ghost convicts you. And then you decide what you're going to do about that. You decide whether you're going to continue on, or whether you're going to fight against it, or whether you're going to give it up. And a lot of times, I know until we are either raptured out or buried, we're going to fight this flesh. We're going to fight this flesh, which is what Romans 7 talks about. We're going to fight it. We're never going to be sinlessly perfect. No matter what certain preachers have to say, the Bible says even just the thought of foolishness is sin. Just the thought of it. You don't even have to commit the act. Which a lot of times, we're like, oh, well, I didn't do it. If you think about when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, he said, if you think it in your heart, you don't even have to commit the act of adultery, but if you think it in your heart, that's who you are. And you can on the outward appearance be like, oh, look at me, I've never done this and I've never done that. But if you do those things in your heart, God looks on your heart. And so you can have, just like the Pharisees, you can be all cleaned up on the outside, but filthy on the inside. And somewhere God showed Demas that he was dirty on the inside. And he was faced with something, and he faced with it, and he saw it, and he said, oh, I kind of like that. And the other part of him said, no, Christians don't do that. Christians don't go there. Christians don't say that. Christians don't watch that. Christians don't listen to that. Christians don't whatever. And his flesh said, but I really like it. And how many times do you, as a Christian, do you say, but I really like it? And you let yourself down and you let God down because you allow yourself to be tempted, drawn away of your own lust and enticed. That's what the Bible says. You're drawn away of your own lust and enticed. And eventually it leads to sin, and eventually sin leads to death. So if you don't learn to acknowledge, hey, I'm failing right here, and ask for help, eventually you'll end up like Demas, where they say, and again, if you've been at any church any time at all, if you do like I do and you pray down through the rows, there are people missing that used to get prayed for that sat in certain spots in this church. People not here anymore. They've left. They're not here. And a lot of times when they leave, they don't just go to another church. They're out. They're out in the world, just like Demas. And so I wanted to look in John chapter number 18, verse number 15. And I think I read this read part of the story a couple weeks ago. But it says, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Now, if you remember that Jesus told the disciples, all of you will forsake me. All of you, including John. all of you will forsake me. Not one of you is going to pass that test. All of you will forsake me. And Peter said, not I. And Jesus said, yeah, you too. Me paraphrasing, yeah, you too. It's going to happen to you. And he said, I'll die before I do it. And Jesus told him, he said, look, I know how you feel, but it's not going to happen. I know how you feel. And a lot of times we feel like we have overcome our flesh. And you're like, I will never. And the defeat is worse when you've said, I will never. It's just worse if you say, I will never do this, and then you find yourself doing it. It's so much worse. And so here's Peter. He said, I will never forsake you. I'll die before I forsake you. And now here he is, and he's following Jesus. And again, in my mind, I think he thought he was doing right. He was like, I'm not going to forsake him. I'm going with him all the way. And somehow John gets in, and Peter doesn't get in, and he's standing out. And you look right here. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. So John knows that Peter is here. John not only knows that Peter is there, but he says, oh, they didn't let Peter in. And he went and he said, hey, can you please let my friend in? Let Peter in. And they let him in. So he's not only been associated with Jesus, he's associated with John. And now here he is. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? Also because John was one of his disciples. She said, hey, John just came and said, let my friend Peter in. And then she said, hey, aren't you also one of his disciples? Aren't you like John, one of his disciples? He saith, I am not. I mean, it's a sad thing, Brother Parks. I don't think, Riley, I don't think he saw it coming. He didn't see it coming. Because I'll be honest with you, if you know you're weak in an area, what you don't want to do is stand up and tell everyone, hey, by the way, I'm going to deny the Lord. You're just going to be real quiet. And when Jesus says, hey, y'all are going to deny me, you're going to be like real quiet. You're like, Lord, I know my heart, and I struggle, and I'm probably going to be that one that's going to deny you. But Peter said, no, it will never happen. It will never happen. Never, not one time will this happen. And it wasn't even tough, Paul. It wasn't even like they're holding a sword to him and be like, we're going to kill your wife and your mother-in-law if you acknowledge that you're one of his disciples. She just asked a question. She just asked a question. It wasn't like he was put through some kind of crucible or anything. She simply said, hey, aren't you one of them also? Right there was John. And John comes and said, hey, let my friend Peter in. And so I let you in. I'm just like, hey, aren't you one of them also? It wasn't even a tough question, Brother Parks. He said, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him and spake openly to the world, and ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort. And in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, if I spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest, and Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto them, art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I'm not. Now you got to remember, Peter had just cut off one of their ears. He had just cut off one of their ears, and Jesus put the ear back on. And they're like looking, they're like, no, I'm pretty sure I saw you. I'm pretty sure I remember you with a sword in your hand. Not just a very few moments ago. And how many times in your Christian life have you been in church? You've been in church and the message was preached, and you go down to the altar. You go down to the altar and you pray, and sometimes before you even make it out the door, you've forgotten. You've forgotten. And you fail. And you've said something. You're like, I'm not gonna talk bad about Paul anymore. I'm not gonna say another bad word about Paul. And then someone says, I'll tell you what, that Paul's a hard worker. And be like, Paul's a hard worker. He just likes to wear the shirts. He ain't really that hard a worker. I'm not gonna say anything bad about Ben ever again. And Ben makes it so tough. And then he does something. You're like, man, I said something bad about Ben again. I'm making it ridiculous, but y'all understand what I'm saying. Sometimes you get out on the altar and you pray and you ask God and you tell God and you make a promise to God and you say, I will never do this again. And Peter said, I will die for you. He cut off a man's ear to show his devotion. And now here he is, he's standing and all they're being like, I think you're one of them. And he's like, I am not. I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. Now, if you look in Matthew chapter number 26, Matthew chapter number 26. Verse number 74. Then, let me read 72. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. So he didn't just like say, I don't know the man. It was an oath. I swear to you, on my mother's grave, I promise you, I do not know the man. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a while came unto him they that stood by and said to Peter, surely thou also art one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee. Then began he to curse and to swear. He said, I tell you what, boys, I'm gonna prove to you I'm not, because you all say my speech bewrayeth me. I'm going to prove to you I'm not, so I'm going to curse and I'm going to swear. Now, that's one thing. That's one thing I have never. It's never been my thing. This has never been my thing. My dad didn't talk bad. My mom didn't talk bad, and for the most part, I don't want to say they ever did. But I grew up around truck drivers. Like my childhood was around truck drivers. And they all talk bad. Every one of them. They don't know how not to talk bad. If you were in the military, they talk bad. That's just how they do. They talk bad. And maybe that's, you're on construction sites, they talk bad. You're on the job site now. I think in public school they only teach 4-letter words anymore. I think that's all the higher they get. Because you can't say 3 words without saying one of them. And so it's never been my thing. But some people it was. Some people it was. They're like, man, I tell you what, before I got saved, ooh boy. And they'll get mad and they'll say something they wish they had. And Brother Wayne, it just breaks their heart. Look what happens to Peter right here. Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew, and Peter remembered the word of Jesus, which said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. He went out and wept bitterly. Why? Because he failed. He went out and wept bitterly because he failed. And I'm going to say, and I'm going to make an assumption here, the difference between Peter and Demas was how much he wept when he failed. And the Bible doesn't tell us, so I'm making an assumption. You'll have to just grant me. Paul said, bear with me a little in my folly, and probably most of my Sunday school teaching is a little folly. But you understand what I'm saying. Bear with me a little in my folly. Peter said, I made a promise to God. I made a promise. I made a promise to God, Jesus, who was God. I made a promise to God and said, God, I'll never do it. I'll never let this happen. I'll never say these words. I'll never say those words again. Those words will never come out of my mouth again. And in a moment of weakness, those words come out of his mouth again. They said, your speech bewrayeth thee. You're like, oh, my speech. Oh, well, I'll prove to you I'm not a Christian. Listen to how I talk. And if you've ever had these words spoken to you, whether you admit it at the time or not, they really hurt. Has anyone ever looked at you and said, I thought you were a Christian? Now, they're going to weaponize that. They're going to use that against you, Riley. They're going to say that sometimes when you were doing right. But when you do wrong and you know you did wrong, and someone in the world calls you out and says, I thought you were a Christian. Brother Wayne, it'll cut you to the heart if you really care. If you're like Demas, you're like, yeah, I just, that's just my job. I just work for Paul. I'm not really part of them. So I'm here for the party. But if you're like Peter and that cock crew, he's like, it says he went out and wept bitterly. Bitterly. And so when you fail, do you care? Does it matter? You're like, no big deal. Everyone fails. And everyone does fail. Everyone does fail. Everyone fails. But what they do about it is what matters. What they do about it is what matters. If you work for Luke and your first week on the job, he's probably going to be pretty lenient. If you work for him 2 years and you're still making the same mistake you made on day one, he's probably not going to be as lenient. And if you have an I don't care attitude, like, so what? They're going to cover it with sheetrock anyway. No one's ever going to know. It's just going to get covered with sheetrock. It's just up here on the roof, and no one sees, unless they have a drone, they're not going to see what's on the roof anyway. And so, what's the big deal? I think Paul said when he does his metal jobs, he likes to pre-drill his holes. That way he knows they're all going to line up. They're all going to line up perfectly. But a lot of people just like, rant. Why? What's the matter? No one's ever going up there anyway. They're never going to know. What's your attitude when you fail? What do you care? You're like, you know what? We live under grace. We're not under the law anymore. We live under grace. Do you take your Christianity seriously? Do you take your walk with God seriously? And do you understand that as you sin, you're breaking the heart of God? Peter went out and wept bitterly. And because of that, in Mark chapter number 16, In Mark chapter number 16, and we studied this last year probably about this time. Mark chapter 16, verse number 7. Let me read verse 6. And he saith unto them, Be not affrighted, ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold, the place where he laid. But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter. So here are the angels, and they're announcing that Jesus has resurrected, and they're announcing it to the Marys, and they're announcing that Jesus has resurrected. And you know, a lot of times when someone messes up, it's not just in private. You know, especially nowadays where, you know, I mean, you got, you know, back in the day it was telephone, tell a friend, tell a woman. That was the fastest way to get any kind of news out. But now, I mean, you got Facebook, and you got whatever other social media platforms people are on, Twitter or X, whatever it's called now. You got those things. And sometimes, like, it's out. I mean, not like, I saw so-and-so at the Walmart. They're still in Walmart. They ain't even made it to the other aisle. They're just saw them. And word is out. Boom. I mean, it's blasted. And before long, everyone knows. Everyone knows. And so I don't think the other disciples, I think they heard that Peter denied the Lord. And here's the angel, and the angel tells these women, they go to Jesus' disciples and Peter. You ever had someone let you down? You ever had someone just fail and let you down, and you get aggravated with them, Brother Parks? You do. You're aggravated with them, and you don't understand why they thought what they thought, or why they felt the way they felt, or why they did what they did, and so your natural inclination is to exclude them. So it almost sounds to me like in the Mary's hearts, they said, I tell you what, we'll go tell the disciples, but we're not going to tell Peter. Not considering that Jesus said they're all going to forsake me. Just Peter's was just most public. And Peter's was also most public because he's the one that said, I'll never do it. They all did the same thing. Some of them didn't come out in public like Peter did and say it as vehemently as Peter did, but they all did the same thing. They all denied him. And so that God, through the angels, said, I remember that Peter wept bitterly. I remember that Peter didn't just go on living in it. He didn't just say, oh, well, I failed, so I guess, you know, I'll just keep going down that path. Immediately, he went out and wept bitterly. Immediately, he went out and repented and said, God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know this was in my heart. You, even your darling, precious son, that I love more than anyone, could not convince me that this was in my heart. But it was there. And he went out and wept bitterly, and therefore the angel said, hey, you go tell Peter as well. And so who comes to the tomb? Who comes to the tomb first? It was John and Peter. It was John and Peter that run to the tomb. In John chapter number 21, John chapter number 21, verse number 15, and I know I read this the other day, in John chapter number 21, not John 15, John 21, verse 15, here's Jesus, and he's talking to the disciples again. And so when they had dined, Jesus saith unto Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? And y'all remember, I don't have to read it, but y'all remember the story. 3 times he asked him basically the same question. Do you love me? And every time, Joe, I know he went back in his heart and said, I do. And I failed you. I mean, you think about time after time, how Peter, because he was so bold, he put himself out there, and because he put himself out there, we got to see his failures. Whether it was when it was time to walk on the water, he was the only one bold enough to say, I'll come out there. If it's you, bid me come unto you. He gets out on the water, he looks around at the waves, and like, oh, Lord, save me. And Jesus rebukes him. And then another time Jesus had to say, get thee behind me, Satan. Just you just said something good. Now you just said something stupid. Get behind me. And so that was Peter. And here he is, and that failure is very fresh on his mind. That failure is fresh on his mind. And he said, lovest thou me more than these? He saith unto him, feed my lambs. He saith unto him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? He saith unto him, yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He saith unto him, feed my sheep. He saith unto him the third time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved. It hurt him. It hurt him. He said, Peter was grieved because he said unto him the third time, lovest thou me? And he said unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee. And Jesus saith unto him, feed my sheep. So here he is, and he's failed. But he didn't let his failure define him, and he didn't stay in that failure. He got back up. Verily I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. This spake he, by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, follow me. So here is Jesus, and he just had that conversation. And he's like, look, I want you to understand something. This is your job. Follow me. If you fail, get back up and follow me. If you have great success, Peter's about to have great success. Get back up and follow me. Just follow me. Peter saith, then Peter, turning about, seeth a disciple whom Jesus loved following, which also leaned on his breast at supper and said, Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee? Peter, seeing him, saith to Jesus, Lord, and what shall this man do? A lot of times, Ben, we're too much worried about what Brother Wayne's doing. We're too worried about what Paul's doing. We're too worried about what Brother Parks is doing. And Jesus tells him, he said, and again, I mean, Peter got rebuked more than anyone. Jesus saith unto him, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? What's that to you? What's it matter? What's it matter what God chooses to do in Zach's life? What's it matter what God chooses to do in Elijah's life? If it's my will for him to tarry till I come, what is that to thee? He said, Peter, I need you to focus. And here's what I want you to focus on. He said, what is that to thee? He said, if I will that he come, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. I need you to focus. Here's your focus. How are you following Christ? Somewhere in Demas's life, somewhere in his life, he forgot or he chose not to follow Christ. He looked at the world and said, man, I tell you what, this is really not any fun. This is not fun. Paul, he's either always in prison or about to be in prison or going to prison. This is crazy. And here we are, and we're worried for our lives, and we've been shipwrecked, and we've been this, and we've been that, and all these things, and we're just not having any fun. And look at them out there. They're smiling, and they're never in trouble, and they're not. And he convinced himself that the world had something to offer that Christ didn't have to offer. And he took a very short, however long you live, compared to eternity, it's a very short amount of time. He took a very short amount of time and said, I'll give up my whole, if he was lost, he gave up his whole eternity and went to hell. If he was saved, and he's saved yet so as by fire, he shows up in heaven, and everyone else has got crowns to cast at Jesus' feet, and then everyone else has got, is being rewarded for the deeds that they've done. And here comes Demas, and he stands before God, and he stands there ashamed. And so here's Peter, and Jesus is saying, Peter, I need you to focus. Follow me. Just follow me. As long as you follow me, as long as you follow me by my example, as long as you follow me by my words, as long as you follow me, I know you're going to fail, and I'm going to be here to get you back up. Jesus never left Peter down. When Peter failed on that water, it was Jesus that picked him up. When Peter failed denying the Lord, he said, hey, y'all tell Peter. Don't just tell the disciples. You tell Peter as well. If you fail, get back up. If you fail, get back up and go on. Thank you.